Welcome to Curious Campus, where we talk to professors from various departments at the University of Toronto about a recent research topic they've dived into, breaking down these new developments for everyone to understand. Stay tuned, you'll definitely learn something new. I'm Chubby, and today I'm here with Professor Joshua Pilzer, and we're here to talk about his research in his book, Quietude, Musical Anthropology of Korea's Hiroshima. To talk about Professor Pilzer, Joshua D. Pilzer is a professor of ethnomusicology in the Faculty of Music and an affiliate faculty of the Center for the Study of Korea. His research focuses on the anthropology of music in modern Korea and Japan, women's musical words, and the relationships between music, survival and memory, traumatic experience, marginalization, disability, public culture, mass media, social practice, and identity. He is particularly interested in everyday musical practice as a life resource and in the musical features of so-called extra-musical practices like speech and everyday movement. Today we're here to discuss his book, Quietude and Musical Anthropology of Korea's Hiroshima, which won the Alan Merriam Prize from the Society of Ethnomusicology, recognizing the book as the most distinguished English language monograph in the field of ethnomusicology, published as the author's second or a later monograph. Without further ado, Josh, welcome to Curious Campus.
Thank you for having me.
It's great. So to start off our discussion, I'm very curious about how you got interested in the field of ethnomusicology and how you define that for the audience.
So yeah, it's a mouthful, right? Ethnomusicology, So musicology, that might sound more familiar to you, which just means the study of music. But musicology, as it is now practiced in North American university settings, is the study pretty much of Western art music and related kinds of music. So ethnomusicology is kind of two things. On the one hand, the ethno in ethnomusicology doesn't mean ethnic. Well, it does actually, but ethnic just means cultural, right? So ethno, for instance, the term ethnology or ethnography. Ethnology is the study of culture and ethnography is the writing of culture. So ethnomusicology just means something like cultural musicology. It's really all that it means. And it allies the field with anthropology. So on the one hand, ethnomusicology is essentially music anthropology, and that means it could be music of anywhere, how music is a part of the social and cultural life.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, the way that ethnomusicology oftentimes, although decreasingly so, but this persists, functions within the university is that there are all these other people, musicologists and music theorists, teaching Western art music, so then we get brought in to do everything, responsible for the entire rest of the world, which is an impossible assignment, of course. But I really stick to the first definition of ethnomusicology, that it's the study of music, as part of the social and cultural life that we are all living, regardless of place, regardless of ethnicity. Grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, in this very musical environment, but in one that was not particularly centered around classical music. And what I understood to be, if you went to school to study music, you went to school to study that. That was what I understood in the 80s when I was starting to look for colleges to go to. And anyway, but I had grown up playing music, other sorts of music. And then when I got out of college, after taking a very general sort of liberal arts degree and was just working and playing in bands and so on, I started to feel the kind of limitations of my own personal experience. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, as I said, in the South. In that part of the world, we really just don't know what exists beyond the boundaries of the United States. We're pretty sure Canada's up there, We think they speak Spanish, possibly, once you get to Texas or somewhere, but it's all just on the map. It just says, there be dragons, So I grew up, I think extremely ignorant about the rest of the world, and that was something that I really wished to correct. And I wanted to go places, and the first thing that I could do back in Nashville after graduating from college was sort of listen to the world of music. And this was a time when this sort of quote-unquote world music boom was happening in the 1980s and 1990s. And so a lot of things were available, a lot of kinds of traditional music, a lot of kinds of world beat music, many different things were available for you to listen to. So I found myself in a library at Vanderbilt University listening to essentially the world of music. And I decided that I was going to go to either Korea or Albania and become an apprentice to a traditional musician in one of those places, because I was completely blown away by the music that I heard on record from those places. And I wrote them letters, and I wrote, what did I write letters to the kind of national performing arts institutes, And Albania, I mean, this was 1992 or something. I don't even know if I got the postage right or anything, And anyway, of course, nobody wrote back to me because I had no institutional affiliation and whatever. And I sort of despaired, and I went back to the library, and I told my story to this librarian, and she brought me this book, and she said, have you ever heard of ethnomusicology? Ethnomusicology puts you on a track to go to these places and study these kinds of music. And I was just, it was like, and angelic voices, Trust your librarian. Ask librarians questions. They know a lot about potential futures for you. So, yeah. And so then I signed up, and I did a master's at University of Hawaii, where I was studying Korean music, and everything else basically kind of unfolded from there.
And it's really cool that you talk about how you actually found yourself in Korea after all of this, because I found it really interesting that even in your book, you first mentioned that you grew up in the United States and then you just like found yourself on like the other side of the world, like studying their music and culture. Was there a kind of focus that you had gone into it with, saying like, because the main focus of the book is like to talk about music as a healing mechanism, but is that what it started off as, or was this something you found as you progressed through your research?
Definitely something that I found. I think I started out of a kind of raw interest in musical sound. Even though ethnomusicology is the study of the social and cultural life of music, I was not particularly interested in that, I think, at the beginning, because I just heard these recordings and I thought, oh my goodness, I have. But then finding out why music matters in different contexts, adds a whole new depth to your understanding. So I started out studying vocal music. This is a long time ago. Traditional vocal music that had been, by the early 20th century, was performed almost entirely by Korean courtesans. And there's a courtesan institution in Korea that was very much affiliated. Basically, courtesans were almost like state slaves in a way, but they were also, professional entertainers. And you can watch Korean dramas about Korean courtesans these days. There's a very famous old one, I can't remember the name, about chefs in the palace, and the women chefs had to make food for the queen and the princesses and all the women in the court, right? Same thing went for medicine. And then there were, there were lots of dancers and poets and, singers and so on. So these people end up inheriting this genre that I was really drawn to. And I learned how to sing a couple of these songs, and I didn't really think too much about what they meant. But then I started to notice that this was women's music. This was music that was all about these people coping with essentially not being free, And once I realized that, it was devastating realization, but makes the music that much more meaningful, obviously. And after that, I got interested in women's issues and women's musical worlds in Korea in general. By the time the 19th century rolls around, there are a lot of rules, and a lot of those rules pertain in the sort of Neo-Confucian period in Korean Peninsula, where a lot of rules governing people's lives, And the music of the lower classes, the lower castes, I probably should say, is noticeably free compared to the relatively regimented lives that they had to lead. This goes for women's musical worlds as well. A lot of freedom to mess with the words in folk songs and a lot of improvisation. And anyway, I was drawn to all of this stuff. And as I started to look into courtesan culture, I found my way to the story of the comfort women, or the sexual slaves of the Japanese people who had been enslaved by the Japanese military for sexual labor during the Asia-Pacific War, including World War II until 1945. And so my first book is about survivors of that system. I would say that my primary interest is not necessarily in music as a healing mechanism, but music as maybe as a coping mechanism, but music is also a way of establishing, maintaining relationships with society if you're an extremely marginalized person, So the comfort women survivors who I worked with first, a lot of them were really, really interested in very, very mainstream music, because in the aftermath of all this sexual violence, they were generally pushed to the margins of society as sort of disgraced women or something, but yearned for kind of social membership. And one of the ways that some people found personal ways of establishing that is by creating these relationships with and this cultural literacy of extremely popular songs. So I got interested in all that. And then that followed on into this second book project. which obviously is complicated by the fact that there's so little music in it. The first line of the book, I think, is, "This book is not about music," or something like that. And then the second line is, "It's about a musical appreciation of art of life and the art of survival," something like that, you know.
Yeah. And it's great that you mentioned that about the book, because I'm very curious about how that really changed your approach of, well, one of your musical appreciation and what you wanted to learn, where all of this musical appreciation was actually coming from silence rather than actual songs and sound.
So in former project, I had made this song anthology, you know. I had recorded all these, I think it's like 420 songs. And I sort of expected that when I went to work with the Korean survivors of Hiroshima, that it would be a similar project, because there's people of a similar generation and older people, you know, people in their 80s, 90s. Basically, the older you get in the Korean Peninsula, you know, the more attached people in general get to singing, you know, because, you know, with all of the war and colonialism and upheaval and authoritarianism and everything that Korea has had to put up with in the last, you know, 130 years or so, the instrument that's the hardest to take away from you is your voice, you know. It can be done, but it's difficult. So song becomes very, very important, you know, in Korean, you know, modern history, culture of Korean modern history. So I had all these songs from the Comfort Women Project, and then I went to Hapjeon, this small town, rural town in southeastern Korea, expecting to do something similar, you know. And I have my microphone, looks like Mickey Mouse, you know, it's a very friendly looking little microphone. And I had spent a lot of time with people, and then at some point I realized, gosh, you know, I've been here for half a year and I've got around 25 songs or something, and they don't actually feel that important to me. It feels like what's important is, for one, the fact that there aren't more than 25 songs, you know. And then the other ways that people go about expressing themselves. I was confronted with this kind of quandary. You know, here I am, an ethnomusicologist. What I do is I had thought up until the present that I study music, you know, that I study a musical object, like songs or, you know, performances or recordings or whatever it might be, even music in people's lives. And then I wasn't finding that musical object. And so I had a choice to make, you know, should I go do something else, you know? But I didn't want to do that because I was really invested in the people and doing whatever I could to tell some portion of their stories, you know, because for all kinds of personal reasons, but also because this is a group, you know. I mean, probably not many people listening to this podcast know or knew that there were a tremendous number of Korean victims of the atomic bombing of Japan, you know. There were around 70,000 Koreans in Hiroshima on the day of the bombing, and roughly half of them died then or soon after. And then 30,000 then were repatriated to South Korea, and 5,000 remain in Japan. And the international political scene, right? This is now the Cold War. Japan has sort of this beautiful book by one of our own luminous faculty, Lisa Yoneyama, called Hiroshima Traces, which is all about the process by which Japan, Cold War Japan, really claims the atomic legacy as its own. And that means, you know, no place for a long time for the Korean victims of the Hiroshima bombing. The Americans, of course, don't want to know anything about it because best just not to talk about it if possible. This is the era of enormous proliferation of nuclear weapons, you know, and the less that we can know about or we can, you know, tell people about the consequences of the use of nuclear weapons in wartime, the better. Korea also, I mean, for South Korea, you know, the atomic bombing of Japan is written in the kind of canonical history of South Korea as this thing that participated in the liberation of South Korea from Japanese colonialism, which ended, you know, right then, you know. And so the idea that there were, you know, 70,000 victims, Korean victims of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, it destabilizes that very comfortable narrative of the atomic bomb equals Korean liberation, you know. So anyway, a lot of reasons why people don't want to suppress this history. And so it wasn't something to walk away from. And it wasn't something for me to walk away from because I had all these personal relationships with people that had been cultivating over such a long time, and I didn't want to do that anyway. So the question was, what else can I do? Maybe the first question is, what explains this kind of atmosphere of quiet that I've sort of found there? And the book really, and the title, you know, Quietude, is a way of saying that this quiet is a kind of way of life, you know. It starts as a way of life because people are trying to keep their heads down and stay out of trouble. If it became known in South Korea in the 50s and 60s, that you were a first-generation victim of the atomic bombing, you might find it very difficult to get married, for instance, because people would be thinking that there would be some kind of transmission to the children of radiation-related illness and disability. The quietude as a kind of poetics or a kind of way of life, and the way that translates into. So it starts out there in the post-war with people keeping their heads down, staying out of trouble and getting on with their life. But it folds in all these other things. I mean, these are people who most of them grew up in Japan, obviously. And so they grew up with all this silence is beautiful, rhetoric, and the idea of not putting yourself forward, and the nail that sticks out gets hammered down, and all these people go, in all these very different ways, become very quiet, people, and then, embody that in speaking in different ways, embody that in testimony in different ways. Another thing about the quietude is that when people in the post-war spoke about their experiences of victimization of the bombing, there was a kind of normative assumption in Japan that if you did so, or in Korea as well, if you spoke about your own suffering, well, everybody else has their own suffering too. So why are you speaking about yours, You must be doing it for some kind of motive of personal gain, exactly. So, and people really had to fight back against that when they gave testimony and so on. And so the manner in which people give testimony about the atomic bomb is not, emotional and expressive and tears and all this kind of wide range of emotional expression, which is how testimony had been when I was doing the Comfort Women project. Here the testimony is almost flat, as if you were just giving an objective, a kind of textual account of what happens. Nothing personal about it. This is just what happened. I am narrating this to you. So that becomes another reason for people being less demonstrative and less expressive and so on. And sort of tracing all that, was really quite an incredible experience. To think that people could be expressive by restraint, in sometimes ways that are more effective than one can be expressive through lack of restraint and expression. So it was quite an amazing process.
Yeah, it was like a horrible time that you were talking to these people about that probably like hurt them, and especially, as you mentioned, it was hard for them to even talk about them to people either in their own country or region, but also to visitors coming. You talked about the kind of emotion and the storytelling that was given through this form of self-restraint of like just telling the narration instead of giving like a personal view of it. What did you really like learn about, I guess, like human nature and empathy through this research? Because it's like very different from how you had been studying like music per se, because now you were focusing on concepts of listening more attentively and such.
Yeah, so the listening is kind of obviously a kind of keystone of this book, And it's funny that, it's not funny, I guess. It's interesting that people in my field, are supposed to be professional listeners because we're musicians and because we have to listen to music and then we have to recreate it and we have to play music with other people, and that means different kinds of coordination of different kinds, and that so there should be very highly attuned kinds of professional listening that people do, and I think there are, but it seems unfortunate that facility is so rarely applied elsewhere to things other than music. So one of the contentions of this book is that, people who study music can turn that kind of attentiveness to basically anything else and reveal things that other people might not be paying attention to. So when you start listening like that, I think one thing that I found myself doing very much from a musical perspective is listening beyond what people are saying. So a lot of times listening is one of these overused words, Listening to fill in the blank. There's probably 100 books being written right now that are called Listening to Something. And I'll bet you that around 2 or 3 of them will actually be about some kind of process of concrete listening. So listening is a kind of metaphor for different kinds of attentiveness usually. And one thing that when people do, listen to others, oftentimes they're listening to extract a kind of message, there's some kind of content here that I'm supposed to be, digesting or apprehending, and then anything else can go. Yeah. But listening in a more musical kind of way, you pay a tremendous amount of attention to how people say things, to the register, pitch register of their voice, to the cadence of their voices, to when their voices change timbrally in different kinds of ways, to when voices fall silent. And, if you're just looking for a message, well, then the silences in between just don't matter. You just cut, Control X, But maybe those silences matter. In this case, they matter, I think, a great deal, So that's the kind of listening, I suppose, that I'm talking about. Now, how does that relate to the idea of empathy, or how does that encourage one to be more empathetic? I hope that it does, because, you are, of course, listening to someone's message, but you're also listening to the way that they say things, to the silences. You're also attentiveness listening, and then in this sense becomes a metaphor, because you're also paying attention to gesture, body language, all that kind of stuff. So you really have to kind of take a person on board in a way that you might not otherwise. And, that means that whatever you're thinking, for instance, whatever you're thinking about saying in response, becomes really tremendously less important. And for me in this book, like, I do interviews and things, but the questions are almost just, I ask questions because I'm expected to ask a question, I don't have a particular question that I want a particular answer to. And so that means, like, letting people guide the conversation. And letting people guide the conversation means that, generally people are not going to talk about those things that happened to them all that time ago. They're going to talk about something else. And that's really quite important to me. So giving people an opportunity of presenting themselves to you sort of however they want to. And there are expectations, like me as a foreign researcher coming to this place. At the very beginning, at least, people assume that I'm there to hear the story of August 6th, 1945. And so I heard that story, but then I didn't ask about it. Going forward, and our relationships really changed. And so it's this long kind of process of, I think, co-presence. Co-presence is a word that shows up at important points in the book. And nothing puts you in touch with that co-presence more than when the story, the talk, breaks down and you're just sitting there together, and then you thinking, well, what am I doing here? What are we doing here? And I think that there's a tremendous potential in a moment like that where people just apprehend one another and make it work, And one of the women in the book, Lee Soo-young, would always be, in those kind of moments, she would be like, are you getting enough to eat? I was younger then, I was probably in my early 40s or something, but still, and we have a, 40-year age difference about. So still, she's sort of looking on me a little bit as like a younger person, obviously, living alone in a little motel room in this town for months and months at a time. And that kind of care, And anyway, if people can sit down and form a relationship across all of these divides, cultural divides, linguistic divides, gender divides, divides of experience, and make that co-presence work, I think that's a tremendously hopeful thing in these times, which seem to me to just be fraught with despair on every side,
Yeah, that's really cool that you mentioned it, because I found it really interesting how you also mentioned throughout your conversations how you would pinpoint and dissect whenever your guest would just be silent or laugh or sigh, use hand gestures and things, and it helped with their storytelling ability and your understanding of their overall experience, and not just at the time of the bombing. And based on that, then, generally as as a researcher in ethnomusicology, what did you learn about music or musical terms per se, or objects instead of just music, of it being able to tell and share stories more acutely than if those same stories were just told by words?
Well, again, since I'm pretty much not focused on music in most of this book, there's one chapter that really is focused on music, but focusing in on the quasi-musical, not even on the quasi-musical, but attending to speech as if one was listening to music. That's, I think, a big part of the research. And one thing is that it carries you beyond the message, towards the person, which I think is incredibly important. And voices, are kind of reservoirs of people's history, I mean, everybody knows that one person who's always spoke the same. You know, I remember having conversations with my grandmother. She was 98 when she died, and she basically sounded like she was around 35 her whole life. Not everybody does that. You know, for some people, the voice accrues all of this experience to it, and you can hear it, the grain of the voice, so to speak. So one thing is that it puts you in touch with that sort of thing. The other thing, my very particular interest in, I was saying the quasi-musical, but what I really mean is generally when people speak, we speak without a definite pitch because our pitch oscillates up and down, you know, so quickly that we don't notice it. But if we were to stop talking at any particular moment, we would realize that there was the voice is always pitched, you know, almost always. And so in listening to people speak, there's a lot of very interesting things happening in terms of that parameter. You know, are people speaking without fixed pitch? You know, when do they speak with relatively definite pitch and why? And one thing that I found particularly amazing, I think, in the course of my research is that people have a tendency to speak in definite pitch, which is to say something that sounds like almost musical. You know, when someone sighs, you know, it has a definite pitch for a minute, you know. But there are many other instances of that when, you know, declamatory speech. People do it obviously at times of intense emotion or when they're trying to be really emphatic and so on. But another place where people use definite pitch in speech, and this is, by the way, all a matter of speech prosody. That's the technical term for this, is the kind of extra-linguistic aspects of speech are generally referred to as speech prosody. People use this definite pitch when they are on the edge, when they are about to stop speaking altogether because language is not doing the job. So on the brink of falling silent, you know, someone will say, you know, someone will be talking just like I'm talking now, and then they'll go, oh, I don't know. Like that, you know, that sort of thing. So that there's some kind of relationship between, basically sort of something like music is always there to remind us that words aren't enough, you know. And then when you think about how little words can actually explain of our lives, to just push us in the direction of thinking about what are other means by which we might go about trying to understand people, to understand the nature of experience and so on. So I think that's really something to be gained. I mean, you could say all kinds of other things too, right? Like people go through life not really particularly attentive to the acoustic dimension oftentimes, unless they're complaining about some sort of noise, you know. But, you know, we live in Toronto, this massive city, and I don't know how many jumbo jets fly over us every day, right? But if you just adopt a sound perspective and start to think about the way that sound impacts our lives, conditions our lives, you know, that is also, I think, a very powerful awakening of a kind. And you realize that oftentimes in the academy, we privilege text. In communication, oftentimes we privilege text. In life in general, we oftentimes privilege the visual over the acoustic. So not always, but anyway, I think all of these perspectives are ways in which thinking sort of musically about the world in which we live can be illuminating in different ways.
I'm very curious though, what does mean listening attentively? So this is a thing that we're taught as kids, even in school, right? To be listening attentively to like when other people are speaking, when our teachers are speaking, so we can understand things between the lines or such. What does that mean to be listening like musically to things? Like how does that differ? Because you talk about similar things and how people's pitches change or the speed of their speech and such. So what is the major difference in this kind of listening?
I think the major difference is that you're not listening to what they're saying, you're listening to who is saying it, you know. So you have changed the object that you're attentive to, you know, which I think means if you're only listening for what someone is saying. You know, nowadays in the world in which I live anyway, I teach here, and so of course you expect your students to be listening to you, or in graduate seminars you expect students to be listening to one another, right? But I think a lot of listening in academic context is people listening to what someone else is saying and then thinking about what they're going to say at the same time. Not particularly taking on board, you know, whoever is doing the speaking, you know, any of that, you know. So it's not just reading between the lines, it's casting away the lines for a second altogether, you know. You're not listening to words, you're listening to people, you know, and I wish my students would do that more. Some of them do it extremely well, but some of them do it because of the intellectual culture that we're part of, you know. You're thinking about your grade, you're thinking about, well, what does this article boil down to? And you're thinking about, well, what do I need to do now? And, you know, all that kind of thing. But learning should be a kind of mutual endeavor, you know. it's a group project, I think. You can't do the group project if it's just you, trying to extract messages from everyone else. I feel like that's a great benefit of this sort of reattuned listening, because I would call it listening for the first time, actually.
Yeah, that makes sense. And based on that then, because your research took you to Korea and Japan, and which is quite different from like your environment otherwise or which you grew up in, based on this form of listening and also the research that you delved into, were there any you could pick up on like the differences in like culture and like the speech and how things are just presented based on talking to different people from all these different backgrounds?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one thing about the survivors of and victims of the Korea's Hiroshima is they grew up in this very complicated cultural environment. Grew up in Japan, but with Korean parents, and under Japanese colonialism. So as kind of subalterns, as kind of underprivileged people in Japan, but also in some ways buying into notions of Japaneseness and so on, and trying to assimilate those and perform those, throughout their childhood and even into their later lives. And then also, though, encountering having a Korean personality, like in Korea, for instance, these people are perfectly bilingual, right? So they sometimes have very different personalities in the two languages, So if we're going to stick with the listening theme, I would say that a lot of the people who I've encountered throughout the past, how long have I been doing this? Almost 30 years, come from different cultures of listening than the one that I've just been describing and the one that is given a kind of full expression, in the North American university. Ones which are essentially much better at listening to other people, and where the idea of the social, that you are living in a social arrangement, is primary in people's minds, as opposed to kind of an inconvenience that the individual has to put up with, or something like that. And that is, of course, it makes you definitely feel like, for a long time, me in East Asia definitely felt like a bull in a china shop. I'm just clueless and making every possible faux pas that I could. And most people were very understanding and very eternally grateful for that. But in any case, yeah, I think what the main thing that I learned is that there are different cultures of listening. There are also different cultures of voice too. For instance, and my more recent work is really centered on the notion of voice, maybe moving away from listening a little bit. But there are different cultures of listening. There are different cultures of voice. What do I mean by that? People's voices change much more freely in Japan and Korea, depending on who you're talking to, because the social relationships are so important, And I think that's true for everywhere. The social contract is really foundation of life, as opposed to a kind of set of rules that the individual has to kind of negotiate to get what they want, So, your voice changes if you're talking to your students, or if you're talking to your parents, or if you're talking to a child, or if you're talking to, or if you're at work and you're doing something, have a vocational voice. And it's really quite freeing, because you don't have to be the same person all the time. And I don't think any of us are the same person all the time anyway, but a lot of us go around pretending that we are, and to be able to not do that, the idea that the voice is, it's okay if you can make your voice to suit the occasion, and there's nothing artificial about that. You're not betraying you're not betraying your immortal soul or something by doing, or some essence of who you are or anything. It's a much more flexible way of going about the work of being a person, and I think that just in my own life, all the time that I spent in East Asia has really given me the freedom to not worry so much about that question of, when it gets right down to it, who am I, because to see things as much more relational, much more flexible, much more worked out in the moment. Funnily enough, the moment I stopped worrying about that, all my anxiety about, actually sort of do seem to have a sense of who I am in some sort of way, even though it remains rather flexible. So yeah, and that was a pretty big life lesson for me, and a big benefit of all that time.
It's really cool. And that is why people tell us to explore as much as we can, right? To learn more about ourselves and the world and the environment we live in, to
Absolutely.
be a better part of it. So throughout your book, you mentioned the quietude that comes with it, even though you were trying to make it a musical piece. But there were a couple of points about music towards the end that I really wanted to touch upon, which is one of the things was a lot of the songs that these people that you spoke to would eventually sing, though not quite frequently, was like songs from their childhood that remind them of like better times per se. Is there anything that you found, I guess, through your research in general or anything in the field that's there about the relationship between our memories and our childhood, or particularly like the music from our childhood?
Well, let's see. So, I mean, you have to remember, I mean, I think this is coming out of the chapter in this book, which is about, so the majority of the first generation victims of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima in Korea, not the majority, around 100, there's around 2,000 first generation, I should say, who have registered as first generation victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to some extent in South Korea. And around 100 of them live in this Red Cross Center, which is called the Hapcheon Atomic Bomb Victims Welfare Center. So the part of the book I think you're referring to is when a bunch of the people from Hiroshima, choir from Hiroshima, comes to this welfare center, which is a kind of hybrid, kind of hospice, old folks residence, and with medical facilities, capable of treating certain things about specific atomic bomb victims. The choir sings, and then everybody gets together and has, fruit and snacks and so on. And the different first generation survivors are mixing with choir and sitting around different tables, and everybody's singing all these songs from their childhood. Now, their childhood, was pretty complicated, It depends on, how old they are. If they're around 90 years old now, then that means that they were, 12, 13 or something at the time in 1945. Young, so that all this stuff, all this war is happening actually when they are children. So people have some memories of, I used to swim at high school, or I did this, or I did that. But I would say that their memories of childhood are not unmixedly positive. Also, to the extent that they are in a way like, I had this dream that I was going to be a engine driver, or I had a dream that I was going to, so to some extent, I think music is this, songs, are these vehicles that can transport you in a way to that kind of time. And not just to a time when everything was great, but to a time where certain things seem possible that are no longer possible, or that no longer seem possible. In general, I think I would say that the more important function of music for the people that I work with in this book and the last one is to maintain some kind of a relationship to some aspect of themselves. So, for instance, it's not just remembering childhood. For these folks, for some of them, it's very much about, for instance, these songs are in Japanese. So singing songs in Japanese, you don't often in southeastern Korea, very anti-Japanese atmosphere throughout the Cold War, which continues in Korea, obviously. Very few opportunities to use the Japanese language, and in some sense to practice that part of yourself which identifies with Japan. So I think that it's not just about holding on to childhood, but holding on to one's sense of Japan has been an important part of their experience, that they're not willing to give up entirely. And in fact, then they go back, Quite a number of them went back quite often till it became difficult physically, or, whenever they could afford it, Some people still have family living in Japan and so on. And then the other one is the use of music to maintain a kind of sense of a relationship with contemporary society. So it's always surprised me. I always expected that everybody would be singing songs from their childhood. And it always surprised me just how much people were interested in listening to, singing in karaoke, what have you, singing more contemporary songs. So if you ask somebody what their favorite song is, it's not going to be a song from their childhood. It's going to be something more recent that expresses something about their present and that helps them feel a part of this big fan culture, which is contemporary and not something that's in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really cool that you mention the more contemporary music that they're engaging with, because also towards the end of the book you mentioned how people you spoke to were referring to more pop songs that were related to their conditions of, or like their emotions of, say, walking or disability in relation to like heartbreak, which I thought was really cool. Aside from that, then, what do you wish like people would take away from your book and your experience of learning about this form of music, quote unquote, to people who are suffering from things that they also can't talk about?
I think there's a few things. One is that people who we nominally call victims, are oftentimes people who have had experiences that are beyond, obviously, our own experience and imagination. And the impulse is to look at quote-unquote victims as people who need some sort of assistance of some kind. And that may be true to various degrees. But it's also true that these are people who have come through these, whether it's residential schools or whether it's Hiroshima or whether it's, war or whether it's, Israel-Palestine, whether it's any of these things, experiences that have bestowed onto them a kind of great knowledge about about the world in which we live that is not accessible to everyone. And so when encountering quote-unquote victims, I think it's best to think of them as teachers, and I try to do that in this book, and realize that we, whoever we is are gaining a lot more from this encounter than the quote-unquote victims are. That's one thing. I think another important takeaway is the importance of listening, and you can apply this comprehensively throughout your life. When you listen to other people, don't just listen for what they say. Don't just bide your time until you get to say something back. But probably the most important thing is this is a group of people that has been essentially erased from history over the last, 80 plus years. And at a time when, right? I mean, so throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, for instance, the American, nuclear arsenal was greatly reduced, but it still exists. There's something like 4,000 something, nuclear missiles, and many of them which are deployed all over the world in submarines and launching stations and so on and so forth. And the effort to decommission everything has failed, and the treaties, which are supposed to reduce nuclear proliferation. Some of them the United States has withdrawn from recent memory. But even, before then, the development of new technology for the delivery of nuclear missiles proceeds apace. Of course, also nuclear proliferation elsewhere in the world. The innovation of depleted uranium and bunker buster technology that's not full-blown nuclear weapons as we think of them, but it still relies on nuclear technology, is rampant, and these are people who can tell you what that's like. And, the explosive power of the Hiroshima bomb was some minuscule fraction of what a contemporary nuclear weapon can do. So it's just mind-boggling to think that we're still in this situation where these things are active. Dangers, of course, the proliferation of nuclear energy and, nuclear reactors in places where the recent disaster in Japan, building one nuclear reactor after another along, well-known, well-established, well-understood fault lines. There's just, people are playing Russian roulette with human life on that one as well. And so I think the people in the book can really give you a sense of what the consequences of that human madness has been, raise a flag such that nothing like that ever happens again.
It was quite a book to read, and it's great that you mention all these points, because they were points that were really felt throughout the book in terms of these people's sufferings and the quietness that they've had to keep because of their own conditions and the environments they were in that didn't allow for them to speak of it. Sort of to close off this conversation then, the prize the book won, the Merriam Prize, what it means in terms of this research or to you.
I don't need to brag about the Alan Merriam Prize. Is sort of something in my field that you sort of, if you write a book, you sort of think, wow, it'd be great to get the Alan Merriam Prize. But, when I got the Alan Merriam Prize, I was on research leave in Japan. This was sometime in, March or something like that. And I looked around and I was like, you know what? There is absolutely no one who I can tell about this who's not going to go oh, way to go, Josh. Good. I mean, no one is going to go, what? Really? Like that. So anyway, no, I don't need to brag about that. And it's in the field of ethnomusicology, is a very small field, so it's not like it's going to really create any kind of publicity for the book and for the issue, which is what I would really like to do. So rather than bragging about winning that prize, I would express my desire that, not because I want this book to be read by lots of people for any other reason, that I want people to know about the existence of this community and what amazing people they are, that it's not just because we've talked in this interview mostly about the first generation, but one thing about victimization by radiations is that it's something that continues through generations, right? So the last major chapter of this book is about the second generation who have all sorts of radiation-related genetic inheritances that have made life very difficult for them in different ways, and who receive no special medical support from Japan or South Korea, and certainly nobody gets anything from the United States, who's the perpetrator in the first place. Anyway, so rather than bragging about the prize thing, I would just say if anyone listening is interested in the story of Korean victims of the atomic bomb, or in First Nations, Indigenous, Native American victims of atomic radiation during the experimental phases in the U.S., throughout the Pacific, also, all of these things are things that you could take an interest in, and that would be much more meaningful to me than any kind of other sort of recognition.
Thank you very much for your time, Josh. This was wonderful. So that concludes our episode of Curious Campus with Professor Josh. If anything you heard today interests you, definitely look into the resources he mentioned towards the end of this conversation, and his book, of course, Quietude, A Musical Anthropology of Korea's Hiroshima. Stay tuned to Curious Campus.